Well, happy St. Patrick's Day. And yes, I'm wearing green in honor of St. Patrick. But this morning I'm curious about something. How many likes did you get on your social media posts this week? Zero. You have to be on social media to get likes. And how did that make you feel? If you're not on social media, maybe how many phone calls did you receive from your friends just wanting to say hello and check in and see how you were? Zero. And how did that make you feel? Some of you know I had a birthday this week, and we don't usually make a big thing of birthdays in our house, but this time my dear wife decided to do something special. Now, I suspected something was up. One morning I went out, was on my way in here actually, and I found this big box on the front porch, and it was addressed to Peggy. She wasn't up yet, so I brought the box in and just left it in the hallway. Now, I had no idea what was in the box. And when I came home in the evening, the box was gone, and she never said a word about it. But then on my birthday, this box came out again, but this time it was all wrapped up in fancy paper with a bow on top. And when I opened the box, lo and behold, there was a garden statue of St. Francis of Assisi, patron saint of Italy, patron saint of birds and animals, and patron saint of the environment, and probably several other things as well. And this was special to me because I had done a research paper on St. Francis in seminary to see what he could teach me about spiritual direction. And then when Peggy and I were in Italy, just before COVID actually, we visited Assisi to see where Francis had lived and walked, and we explored the cathedral that had since been erected in his honor. Now, the town hasn't changed all that much since he lived there in the 1200s, so it was kind of cool to walk around. I was so happy about this gift that I wanted to tell the world. And so I took a picture, this picture behind me of Francis and I, and posted it on Facebook. Now, this was late in the day, but a little later on that evening, I thought I would check and see if anyone had noticed. Does this sound familiar? And probably already a dozen people had noticed, and a few people had even made comments. Well, that felt pretty nice. Of course, the next day, and the next day after that, I had to look again and again, and there were hundreds of likes and many, many comments. I was surprised and thrilled that so many people remembered and commented. People I hadn't seen or heard from for years. I must be somebody pretty important. Maybe I should post things on social media more often. And just think how popular I could become. Wouldn't that be great? And I could use that influence to do such good things. I could promote my ideas about life, about caring for the environment, about godliness. Our gospel reading today challenges that way of thinking. Now, Jesus was usually quite accommodating toward others. Think of the time that he turned water into wine at the request of his mother at a wedding, or the time when he cured a Roman centurion's daughter, or the time that he healed a blind man, or we could go on and on. But if I were to give this message title today, it would probably be The Time Jesus Said No. The place was Jerusalem. The time was just before the Feast of the Passover, and people were pouring into the city from all over the country. They were coming in for the celebration of the Passover. The streets were alive with buying and selling, singing and shouting. Probably sandals and shirts were on at reduced prices that week. People were bartering for souvenirs, buying street meat, probably buying pigeons for sacrifices. And everyone was talking about this man, Jesus. There were stories about how he had raised Lazarus from the dead just a few days earlier. And when he came into Jerusalem, crowds went out to meet him, waving branches and cheering him on. Hosanna to the King of Israel. Of course, the Pharisees weren't very impressed with this. Look, they said, everybody's going to him. And among that crowd, we read that there were some Greeks who'd come to Jerusalem for the Passover. Now, we don't know a lot about these Greeks. We don't know where they were from. We don't know why they wanted to be in Jerusalem for the Passover. It's possible that they were converts to the Jewish faith. Maybe they just came for the party. It's where everybody was going. It's where the action was at that time of the year. What we do know is that they wanted to meet Jesus. And the text doesn't say that they had a specific reason or a need that they wanted to present to Jesus. And you'd think that if they did, the text would mention that. But it doesn't say anything about that. Maybe they just wanted bragging rights. We went to Jerusalem and we talked to the man who raised the dead. And look, we got his autograph. It's kind of like going to Toronto during the Toronto Film Festival, hoping to get a sighting of Ryan Gosling. Or better yet, getting to sit in a booth next to him at Swiss Chalet. As if that would ever happen, right? I don't think Swiss Chalet has booths anymore, so it would never happen. Bragging rights. These Greeks wanted to see Jesus, but they had no connection to him. They weren't even Jewish. And if Jesus was hanging out in the temple, it's quite likely that he would have been in the inner courts, an area that was reserved only for Jewish people. The Gentiles and non-Jewish people would have been able to go there. So they need to find some thread of connection. They'd even take a thin thread. Kind of reminds me, last fall when you had a welcome to Plattsville dinner for Peggy and I shared a fun little fact about meeting Mother Teresa in her home in Calcutta. Of course, I didn't just walk up to her house and knock on the door and say, "Hey, it's Gavin. Can I come in for a chat?" This was long before Facebook, so how could she even have known who I was, right? But I knew somebody who knew her. Pranay Sarkar was the president of the Missionary Church in India, and he was a friend of Mother Teresa. Now, I didn't know Pranay all that well at the time, but I was a friend of the daughter of the mentor of Pranay Sarkar. So it's kind of a thin thread, but that was my connection to Mother Teresa, and I'll tell you the rest of the story some other time. These Greeks were looking for any kind of a thread to Jesus. I think that if they had needed something like a healing, that would have been enough of a thread, but apparently they didn't have that. And if they couldn't approach Jesus directly, maybe they could warm up to one of his disciples, and so they pay a visit to Philip. Now, why Philip? Well, maybe because Philip, unlike the disciples who had Hebrew names, Philip was a Greek name, so there's something they've got in common. And verse 21 mentions specifically that Philip was from Bethsaida. Now, why would John include that little bit of trivia in this story? Well, Bethsaida was near the Decapolis, which was a district of 10 Greek cities. And maybe those Greeks were also from that area, so that might be another point in common. But the fact that they greet Philip formally suggests that they probably didn't know him previously. "Sir," they said, "we would like to see Jesus." So they're betting on a thin thread. And Philip isn't even on the inside circle with Jesus, not like Peter, James, and John, who are always around him. We rarely hear of Philip mentioned in the Gospels at all. And when the Greeks come to him with this request to see Jesus, he doesn't take it to Jesus. He doesn't even take it to Peter, James, and John. He takes it to Andrew, who is the brother of Peter, who is tight with Jesus. So Philip may be a long shot, but at least he's somebody that's accessible to the Greeks. Now, the Greeks make enough of an impression on Philip that he takes the request to Andrew. And now what we know about Philip is that he's a very practically minded fellow. In John chapter 6, Jesus was faced with a crowd of over 5,000 people. And he asked Philip, and probably with a wink in his eye, "Where are we going to buy enough bread to feed all of these people?" And Philip replied, "Well, it would take more than a half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each person to even have one bite." And then over in John chapter 14, Jesus is talking to his disciples again. He said, "If you really know me, you will know my Father as well." And Philip replies, "Lord, just show us the Father, and that'll be enough for us." So he's a very practically minded fellow. So what is the conversation then between practically minded Philip and Andrew regarding this request from the Greeks? We don't know. We're not privy to that conversation. But in my imagination, first of all, I imagine a sizable crowd of Greeks, not just one or two or three or four. If it was just a couple of people without any particular need, it would have been easy for Philip to say, well, Jesus has got a lot going on now. He's got a heavy teaching schedule at the temple. There's leaders that want to talk to him. This just isn't a good time. But these guys made enough of an impression on Philip that he talks it over with Andrew. And maybe they're thinking, hey, Jesus is on the verge of something big here. He's about to be crowned the Messiah. And this would be a great opportunity to extend his influence beyond the Jewish world into the Greek culture. These guys are influencers. They mean business. Otherwise, they wouldn't have found their way to us. So whatever the conversation was, they both agree that it's a good idea to take this request to the Greeks for an audience to Jesus, and so they go to him, maybe thinking that if there's two of them, they have a better chance of being heard. Jesus, there's a group of Greeks in town that want to see you. They're real go-getters. We think this is a great opportunity. And I hear Jesus say, Now the time has come for the Son of Man to enter his glory. And I can imagine Philip and Andrew saying to themselves, yes, that's right. You're going to be crowned king, and here's a chance to gain the respect of the Gentiles as well as the Jews. These guys will sing your praises to the whole Greek world. Jesus' next words must have stunned them. I tell you the truth, unless a kernel of wheat, we've got a slide for this, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground, I tell you the truth, unless a kernel of wheat is planted in the soil and dies, it remains alone. But its death will produce many new kernels, a plentiful harvest of new lives. What? Jesus, how is this an answer to our question? We're asking you to meet some movers and shakers, and you're talking about seeds and dying and new crops? Did you hear anything we just asked you? And of course, Jesus understood perfectly well what they had asked, and he also understood the motives of Philip and Andrew and the motives of these Greeks as well. And he responds with an analogy from nature which pointed to the purpose of his life and also teaches us much about our own lives as well. Philip and Andrew have seen this maybe as an opportunity for Jesus to expand his influence. They wanted a triumphant leader. After all, what glory is there in following an anonymous wannabe? And if Jesus was more widely recognized, then they too would gain more respect as his closest disciples. Well, not his closest disciples, but you know what I mean. They were close enough to Jesus. Maybe for the Greeks, they were looking for something like a backstage pass, essentially. Maybe bragging rights for having been close to Jesus. Or maybe just the opportunity to banter about philosophical ideas without any real intention of changing the way they lived. Jesus seems to view this invitation as a distraction. Not unlike distractions that he has faced before. At the beginning of his public ministry, he was tempted by the devil to make a big impression by jumping off of the highest point of the temple. But he resisted. And here's the opportunity maybe to develop a bigger fan base. It must have crossed his mind, but again he resisted. He knew that his purpose in coming to Jerusalem wasn't to develop a bigger fan base, not to become more popular, but to lay down his life. Not at all glamorous, but this was the will of his Father and his first priority. And it would impact, this thing that he was about to do would impact every generation that would follow him. A grain of wheat accomplishes nothing by being passed around and admired by all kinds of people. It just remains a dormant artifact. It's only when it's buried in the ground and left to die that it produces a multitude of wheat kernels, and those of you that are farmers know that so well. Of course, Jesus was pointing to his own death and resurrection, and how his life would be reproduced in the life of his followers through the work of the Spirit. The glory of his death and resurrection was that he opened the way for everyone following him to be raised to new life with him. But Jesus says the analogy of the kernel of wheat applies to us as well. Verse 25, we have a slide for this. Those who love their lives in this world will lose it. Those who care nothing for their lives in this world will keep it for eternity. He's talking about those who live as if this world was all that mattered. Those who live as if gaining popularity and power and satisfying all of their own cravings is what makes for a successful life. Jesus says, no, that'll just leave you empty. If you get 100 likes on your Instagram post, you're not going to be satisfied with less than 150 the next time. If you get that new house or the new car, it won't be long before you want a better one. If we're living to satisfy ourselves, whatever we gain in this world, we're always going to be wanting just a little bit more. Now, Jesus isn't saying that it's wrong to be popular, that it's wrong to love your job, that it's wrong to take care of yourself, or wrong to enjoy the good things that life brings your way. But if your life is all about getting whatever you want, you're pouring your life down the drain, and you're certainly not going to be well prepared for the life to come. Those who love their life will lose it. On the other hand, Jesus says those who care nothing for their life in this world will keep it for eternity. Now, these people that care nothing for their life in this world are not people who are careless. But these are people who care just as much about other people as they do about themselves. People who are willing to make sacrifices so that other people can enjoy the same things that they enjoy. And those sacrifices might come in many forms. It might come in the form of sharing your time with others, sharing your food with others, sharing your home with others, sharing your car with others, listening to others when you'd prefer to be the one talking, taking criticism for standing up for the rights of others. The good news of this passage is that you don't have to be rich or popular or powerful to have a life that is full of meaning, a life that has value, to have a life that's truly satisfying. I think all of us, from the least to the greatest, can be easily blinded by the need for approval or recognition. Maybe we strive for the praise of a boss or the praise of a partner, maybe even for the praise of our children. I've met a lot of people who live for the praise of their parents, and their parents aren't even living anymore, but they're still living under that shadow. Or maybe just living for the satisfaction of 150 likes on your social media post. But chasing recognition and approval from others only leads to emptiness. Whatever we do, it will never be enough. And Jesus is inviting us to a life just like his, a life that found fulfillment in doing God's will and offering himself up for others. He was the kernel of wheat laid to rest in the ground, and we who by faith receive his gift of new life by the Spirit are the plentiful harvest. I keep a little vegetable garden at home, and I've already started growing a bunch of tomatoes and peppers and onions and things like that down on the basement under some grow lights. Seeds are pretty predictable in the sense that I know what kind of fruit I'm going to get if I plant a tomato seed. I've never planted the tomato seed that produced a green pepper. Maybe some of you have. If you have, tell me about it, but I kind of doubt it. Somehow the genetics in that little seed dictate what it's going to produce. It's amazing to me to watch these things come up year after year. And similarly, when the life of Christ that was sown at the cross is raised anew in us, we will produce the same kind of fruit. We'll be like the seed that was planted. Our strongest desire will be to do God's will. Our persistent habit will be willingly serving others. Our countenance will be one of joy. Now, two reasons why our lives don't perfectly match those characteristics yet is that the life of Christ is still growing in us. It takes some time and some intentional training to become like Jesus. And we shouldn't expect to become like Jesus if we're not doing the things that Jesus did. That's part of the package. I can grow take a tomato seed and plant it in the ground. It'll produce a plant. But I won't get a tomato from it unless I nourish it, unless I water it and take care of it. The second reason our lives may not look exactly like the life of Jesus yet is that we haven't completely died to the old self yet. Self-interest raises its head every single day and fools us into thinking that catering to our self-interests is the way to find happiness. But inasmuch as it gives you joy to serve others, inasmuch as you find yourself asking, I wonder what God wants, be encouraged that the life of Christ is growing in you. What difference does it make whether I indulge myself in living for the sake of others or simply living for myself? I think two contrasting stories will help us understand the difference. The first one is the story of Howard Hughes, and we've got a picture on the screen for this. Howard Hughes was one of the richest men in the world when he died in 1976. Now, some of his vast fortune was passed down to him from his merchant dad, who made a pile of money leasing drilling bits to the oil industry. One historian notes that Howard lived many people's guiltiest adolescent pleasures. You can only imagine what kind of a life that would have been. He had a string of wives. He had all kinds of girlfriends. Ava Gardner, who was one of those, wrote about him. Hughes was enthusiastic about only four things: money, movies, aircraft, and beautiful young women with the right proportions. There's a story about him having stayed in the penthouse of a hotel in Las Vegas for an extended period of time, and finally the manager came and asked him to leave, and he just bought the hotel out from under him and set up his headquarters in the top floor of this hotel. And apparently there was another hotel across the road that had this glass slipper icon on it that really bugged Howard. And so he bought that hotel too and dismantled this icon. He had that kind of power and money. It seemed the older that he got, the more eccentric he became. And he lived essentially as a recluse for the last 10 years of his life, from 1966 to 1976. Apparently in that time, he only saw less than a half a dozen people other than his own staff. So he had all the money in the world, but he was living almost in complete isolation. And now, 50 years later, he's all but forgotten. I'm guessing some of you have no idea who I'm talking about. You haven't heard this name before. Contrast that with this other fellow, St. Francis, and you can put his picture on the screen. I mentioned him at the beginning of this sermon. He lived in the 13th century. He was also the son of a merchant. Now, his dad wasn't selling oil drill parts. He was selling fancy cloth, actually. He was a garment merchant. And so he belonged to a family of wealth. And as a teenager, he had a bit of a playboy reputation. But as a young man, he sensed God calling him to build his church. And so he exchanged those fancy clothes for the clothes of a beggar. He left his father and mother, and he chose a life of poverty, working with lepers and outcasts. And he started the Franciscan order with a group of just a handful of friends, actually, that shared his values and shared his lifestyle. And soon there was also an order for that was led by his good friend Claire. And within just a few years, there were over 5,000 men who had joined his fraternity. And Francis, poor as he was, brought renewal to churches all across Europe. The Franciscan order remains vibrant even today. And books are still being written about St. Francis. Some people say that he was, of all the saints, he is the one that lived more closely to Jesus than anybody else. The same kind of lifestyle. So he cared nothing for his life, but his life continues to inspire people to live selflessly. So which legacy would you rather have? The legacy of a Howard Hughes or the legacy of a Francis of Assisi? Chasing money, possessions, popularity won't lead to the rich and meaningful life that God intends for you to have. In fact, those things can only get in the way. A life that is satisfying, that's fruitful, a life that keeps giving back even into eternity, it's a life that follows the pattern of Jesus. I think Jesus is saying to us today, trust me on this. If you want a life that is full and satisfying, it requires dying to self and letting my life take root in you. It's a life that seeks the good of others. Now, I know some of you have been practicing this life of dying to self in these weeks of Lent. We're in the 5th week now. And you've intentionally set aside something that you want in order to make more space for what God wants in you. And I'd just encourage you to notice what God is doing with that offering that you've been making to Him. Give thanks to God for that. And a question for all of us in these closing moments is simply this, and this is on the screen. What's one thing in my life that is driven more by self-interest than concern for others? And I want to give you a moment or so just to think about that. One thing in my life that is driven more by self-interest than concern for others. And what's God's invitation to me this morning around that issue? Let me leave you with that for a moment or so. I'm going to invite the worship team to come up and lead us in our closing song. As they're coming up, I want to invite you to join me in the prayer of St. Francis. Now, St. Francis didn't actually write this prayer. In fact, he probably never saw it. But it expresses the cry of his heart very well, and may it express the cry of our hearts this morning. I think this is on the screen. So will you join me in this prayer? Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.